Brokos. This is a member hand history review, so played by a member of Tournament Poker Edge in a $50 tournament on GGPoker. So right off the bat, I think there's a little bit of a decision here. The suited aces are pretty playable hands. I do think their value goes down a bit as we get shallower. So you can see we're only 300 big blinds deep right now, and that makes calling somewhat less appealing. We also have the very worst possible position given the original raiser. Maybe small blind would be worse, but other than that, it's a lot harder to call in this spot than it is to call on the button because you have these players behind you who might three-better call. Ace-7 suited is also one of the worst suited aces, right? It's not as big as Ace-9. It doesn't make as many straights as the wheel aces do. So I do like the idea of erring on the side of folding here, but I think it's actually kind of close. It's also significant that this is a large raise. For only being 30 big blinds deep, we're facing a 3x raise. We should be less inclined to call that than if this was like a min raise or a 2.5x raise. First, we'd be getting better odds. Secondly, we would expect the opening range to be wider, and we would have better equity against that. So I do like that fold. I think it's a close decision, though. This is one that I would open if it had folded to me. I don't think it's going to play very well facing a raise. We face a lot of the same problems that we face with Ace-7 suited in that, we have a very bad position. The raise is coming from relatively strong spot. It's kind of interesting that this player opened 900 last hand and is open to 750 now. I would, if I were playing in game, I would pay some attention to that. I would think about what does it mean. I probably wouldn't do anything about it in this case, but I would, if he's using different open raise sizes, I would definitely be looking for a pattern there so that I might be able to use it to my advantage in the future. It doesn't necessarily have to mean anything. He could just be changing it based on his position or something. I wouldn't encourage you to go real far out of your way to exploit something like this until you've actually had a chance to correlate the pattern. Right now, we've just seen enough information to tell us, hey, there may be a pattern here. Let's try to look into that in the future. So yeah, I think there's just not quite enough value in calling with this. The problem we're going to run into is that so most flops your hand is very hard to play on, right? The majority of flops don't have an ace or a 10 on them, and those flops are going to be tough to play. And then even on the rare occasion that you do hit an ace or a 10, your hand is not that great. We end up seeing the flop with a stack to pot ratio is like a little under 4. So, and that's in a three-way pot, right? Had the big blind folded, the stack to pot ratio might be a little over 4. And that's like kind of around, it's like borderline for stacking off with one pair. And the problem is you don't make a particularly good one pair with, when you make a pair of aces, you're often going to be outkicked if the opponent gives you action, right? Given that we're up against an early position raiser, he shouldn't have a lot of dominated ace-x in his range. It should mostly be if there's an ace on the board, either he doesn't have one or his is better than ours. So it's hard to get value from this hand. Like we're kind of drawing to a bluff catcher. A 10 high board is a little bit better for us. We're beat less often on a 10 high board, but all the overpairs are still in his range. And again, we may struggle to get action when we are ahead on a 10 high board. And then there's a bunch of boards that we just miss entirely where it's kind of hard to defend our equity. We sometimes end up folding the best hand to a continuation bet, or we fold substantial equity to a continuation bet. It's just a hand that it's very hard to continue past the flop. You're rarely going to flop a good draw with this hand. Case in point, we've got one overcard and a gut shot in a three-way pot. It's relevant that this is a three-way pot because in a heads-up pot, I would allow for more possibility that just hitting an ace could be good. Like if we call a flop bet and then we peel off an ace, there'd be a decent chance that that's the best hand in a heads-up pot. It's less likely to be the best hand in a three-way pot. Just like the average hand that you run up against is going to be stronger with more people seeing the flop, and so it's less likely that you're going to win the pot with a marginal hand like top pair. So I think given that we got probably a slightly above average flop for our hand, actually, even though there's not an ace or a 10 on it, our hand is still very difficult to play in this spot. So I don't know for sure that we want to call this bet. Yeah, I think it's pretty marginal, especially with the risk of this player from the big blind check raising, which he can pretty easily do. I mean, if he has any queen, he's going to check raise, and he has a lot of queen X in his range. I mean, he may not be three betting ace queen preflop. He's probably not three betting king queen preflop, and then he can be calling with like most, if not all, suited queens here in the big blind. So he can check raise all of those. He can check raise when he has king 10. He can check raise when he has 10-9. Helps a little bit that we're blocking that, but it's really not that hard for the big blind to wake up with a check raising hand. I would think we might get check raised here somewhere in the neighborhood of like 5 to 10%, which maybe doesn't sound like that much, but essentially what it means, I mean, if we're not going to call the check raise, I mean, we just have to subtract right away 5% of the pot away from us. Like we're not getting that. So instead of thinking we need to win the pot 19% of the time here, or 24% of the time here, which is what these odds would suggest, we actually need to win the pot more like 30% of the time to account for the risk of this player check raising. That's a pretty significant difference. And like I said, I mean, I think this is marginal enough, even getting 3-1, that with the extra risk of this player behind, I would rather just fold. Once again, we have sort of a tough decision here. It's going to be hard to move this player off of any kind of good hand. We're definitely not getting him off of a queen or better. I'd say decent chance we're not even getting him off of a jack. So what would we be looking to accomplish by betting? Ace king, maybe, if he bets ace king on the flop. Pocket nines, pocket eights, those kinds of hands I think would definitely fold, but I also think it's pretty unlikely that he bet those on the flop. So given that he bet the flop, I think it's sort of either we have the best hand, which I think is unlikely but not impossible. Either we have the best hand, or if we don't have the best hand, I think it's going to be pretty hard to get him to fold. I don't think we can really deny a lot of equity by betting here. The pot is large enough that although I do think we have to fold to a check raise if we bet, I don't really want to put myself in that spot. So I think I'd rather just check behind. Like this, if this were a coaching session and I had the opportunity to talk to this person in person, my question here would be, what was your, I guess first I'd want to know, what was your plan when you called the flop? And then secondly, what were you targeting when you bet this turn? What were you trying to make this player fold? As I have kind of already indicated, I don't think there really is an especially good target. Like I don't think there are a lot of hands that are planning to check fold here that we actually care about making them check fold. And I think the ones that are going to fold, we can bet even smaller than this. I mean, I realize this is like substantially smaller than half pot, but honestly, with the stack to pot ratio being so low, I think we might want to bet something like quarter pot or even a fifth of the pot. And that's still enough to give a decision. If he does have a hand like pocket nines, or I guess ace king can probably call for a fifth pot. So maybe we want to do a quarter pot. But yeah, I mean, I think this is just putting us in a really bad spot now. If he were to check raise, I mean, I think we are just folding to a check raise. But yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think he's check calling very often. Let's put it that way. I think he's very rarely going to check call. I think he's either going to check raise or check fold. And so we want to make the smallest bet that's going to provoke that raise or fold response. If he's going to play raise or fold, whether we bet 1200 or 1800, then there's no sense in betting 1800 because we're getting exactly the same response if we bet 1200. Right? Either he goes all in and we save 600 on our bluffs, or he folds and our bet size probably didn't matter. Like I don't think there's a lot of hands where he's continuing for 1200 but not for 1800. So what I'm seeing here, I would just consider kind of like sloppy play. Like I think the pre-flop call is a little bit sloppy. It's not terrible, but I think folding is like at least slightly better than calling. So it strikes me as a little bit sloppy pre-flop, a little bit sloppy on the flop, a little bit sloppy on the turn. None of these are huge mistakes, but they all kind of add up. And I think mostly they just stem from you're playing a hand that's a little bit too weak pre-flop, and then you just don't have a lot of good ways out of that after the flop. If I were to put money in the pot pre-flop, I would prefer to do it by 3-betting rather than by calling. A lot of times your 3-bets are hands like that one that are just slightly too weak to call. Those can be good 3-betting candidates. Speaking of good 3-betting candidates, this definitely is one. We could have a range that just jams all in here. Like that might be the best play with ace king or some other like pretty strong hands that really don't want to see a flop. Kings, though, I think is strong enough that we can make a less than all in raise. And that doesn't have to mean that we're imbalanced. Right? We can have a range that just jams, and that's going to be like a more linear range. And then we can also have a polarized range that 3-bets, and then those 3-bets are going to be very clearly broken into hands that are planning to fold to a shove and hands that are planning to call a shove. Kings obviously being a hand that plans plans to call a shove. So I would want to 3-bet to about 2,000 here. Let's see what our hero does. Okay, great. Good discipline on folding the 8-6 suited. It's easy to, so I think like the mistake that a lot of people make here holding 8-6 suited is they look and they say, oh, I'm getting like really good pot odds. I'm getting 4-1, maybe it'll even be 5-1 if the big blind calls. That sounds pretty great. The problem is you're also contesting the pot against 3 other players. So, getting 5-1 in a heads up pot is very different than getting 5-1 in a 4-way pot, where in a 4-way pot, you're only expecting to win the pot about 25% of the time. If we assume everyone has an equal chance of winning the pot, you would get it 25% of the time. You probably have a worse hand than average. You definitely have the worst position, so I think you can't really assume that you're going to win the pot a full quarter of the time. This is also not, it is a hand that plays reasonably well multi-way, but it's not a hand that plays well shallow, and we are pretty shallow here. The button and big blind are both like less than 40 blinds deep. This player is less than 30 blinds deep. Even though we have more than 40, we have like close to 50 big blinds, that's not really the effective stack. So this hand, and like 4 ways, it's going to be a pretty low SPR when we see the flop. It's hard to have fold equity in a 4-way pot, so when we flop a draw, it's going to be tough to like play it aggressively and take the pot without going to showdown. Just like, in a 4-way pot, it's pretty likely that someone has a hand, so it's harder to win the pot without showdown when we flop draws, which is most of what this hand is going to do. So I think that's good discipline on our hero's part. So here I would have called this raise had we not seen this 3-bet, and I want to contrast this with the A7 suited previously where I liked the hero's fold. In this case, we have the button, we have a slightly better kicker. Really having the button is, well, there's the 2 most important factors. Probably the single most important is the raise size. So we're facing a min raise instead of a 3x raise, which means we're getting better odds and probably up against a wider range. Secondly, we have position, and then third, we do have a slightly better ace. So sometimes this player has like pocket 7s, pocket 8s, 9-8 suited, and our equity is a bit improved because we have ace-9 suited rather than ace-7 suited. It's not a huge factor. I think the odds and the position are more important, but that is a factor. I'm certainly not continuing to a 3-bet though. This hand is definitely putting money in the pot. Calling and raising are both options. I think I would err on the side of raising. Doesn't need to be a particularly large raise. I'm not really looking to push a lot of folds against the opener. What I'm mostly trying to do is just deny these other players behind me the opportunity to call. Ace-queen offsuit is a hand that plays a lot better heads up than multi-way. If we just call, we're going to be giving a very good price for the big blind to call. Also with a bunch of hands we don't want him in there with. Like he can get in there with like 10-7 suited and hands that are very live against us where we'd rather deny him that equity. The downside of 3-betting is that it opens us up to a shove from this player, and putting in like, I think we fold to the shove actually. I don't think we really want to put in like 35 big blinds with ace queen offsuit here, but we do end up folding away a lot of equity. Sometimes he shoves a hand like pocket 10s where we have real good equity, and that's unfortunate. So that's the downside of raising, is that we do occasionally open ourselves up to a shove. I don't think that happens super often. I think the value of denying equity to these players behind us, and also pushing equity. I do think ace-queen is going to be a favorite against his opening range. So when he calls, I think that we're making a little bit of money on that raise. I think on balance, we're ahead of his calling range. We're just in bad shape against his 4-betting range. But the hands that we really don't want to see are mostly going to jam. Like I think ace-king always shoves, pocket kings always shoves, queens always shove. Aces may slow play to the 3-bet, but for the most part, I think we can kind of assume that we're not dominated when he calls a 3-bet, which is really nice. So I would just do a small 3-bet, like 1,500 or something here. I don't think calling is terrible. As I said, I think it's pretty close, and the weaker the big blind is, the more I don't really care about inviting him into the pot. This would be a tricky flop if we were facing a continuation bet. I think it is going to be very dependent on the size of the bet, but I would err on the side of calling. This is I was assuming that we probably had the best hand pre-flop, and this is a flop that doesn't really change that, right? There's not a lot of 3x or 4x or 6x in either of our ranges. So it's not like I'm thinking, oh, I was ahead pre-flop, but then, a bunch of his range just drew out on me on this flop. So I think, as long as we're getting an okay price, I think we do want to be peeling this flop, even though we don't have a club. With a club, it's definitely a call. Like a backdoor flush draw is really going to make a big difference here. But I think this is a strong enough hand that, we're ahead of so much of his unpaired range that I think it would be worth calling a bet on this flop anyway. That said, I'm glad we didn't face one. I don't think we want to bet ourselves unless we're doing something exploitative. I mean, if we have reason to believe that this player is just going to be too honest with his checks and he's never really checking good hands, then, we can... If that's true, we can assume that we basically have the nuts and can just bet accordingly. We have a hand that's very interested in denying equity by betting, but against an unknown player, certainly against a good player, I just want to check behind here because we do not want to get check raised. It's a pretty ugly turn for our hand. It's not necessarily an ugly turn for our range. What that means is it's not going to be trivial for the original raiser to just, bet this with any two cards. We have plenty of king X in our range, so we are kind of protected against bluffs here. I think this is going to be a fold if he bets. We're going to have better hands in our range for defending. If you remember on the flop, I was saying the main reason why it would make sense to defend this hand on the flop, even though the flop didn't approve us, is that it's also not a flop that was likely to improve him. Now, a king, that's a totally different story. A king improves a bunch of hands in his range that we were previously ahead of. It's also something that he needs to be afraid of that we might have just hit. So I don't think it's trivial for him to bluff here. So I think this is just a fold. Good. The big bet size made it even easier to fold. I especially min raising is often appropriate at shallow stack sizes anyway. It's especially good here given how shallow the big blind is. He's going to do a fair bit of shoving over raises, and so we really want to be able to cut our losses when we have a hand that's not going to be able to call the shove. So before we even see a flop, I want to acknowledge that this is no longer a pot that belongs to us. I think a lot of people make this mistake of thinking, just because you raised pre-flop, that means that you're kind of like the player who's supposed to win the flop or the player who's supposed to bet the flop or something like that. This is not what we were hoping for when we opened. The best case scenario is everybody folds to our open raise. The second best scenario is we just get a heads up against the big blind who calls with a wide range, and then we get to play in position against him. Getting called by players who have position on us is not good news. We could easily get bailed out by the flop. Part of the reason why we're stealing with king queen suited and not with deuce 7 offsuit is that king queen suited can hit a lot of flops. But I think the default should be if the flop doesn't help us in some way, we should be planning on giving up here. Even getting called by a single player who had position on us would be bad. Getting called by two players with position is really very bad for us. And I think we have to adjust our expectations now and say, okay, I'm probably not going to win this pot. So the question to ask when we see the flop is not, oh, how can I win this pot? How can I salvage this pot? I think the question to ask is, how do I cut my losses in this bad situation? Well, that's interesting. This would be a tougher spot if we were deeper. I think given that we're stack to pot ratio 3 against button, like 3.5 against cutoff, I think we do have a hand that's strong enough to stack off, at least against one player. I'm not excited about it. I think we can start with a relatively small bet, actually. We are multi-way pots in general. You want to use smaller bet sizes, and I think a lot of people think about their bet sizing the wrong way. So they look at a board like this and they think, boy, I really don't want to see another card. I'm going to bet big. The problem with that is you haven't identified a target. You haven't said, what am I trying to accomplish exactly by betting big? Whether you see another card is not ultimately up to you. If your opponent has, say, the ace of diamonds, the queen of diamonds, or a king plus a diamond, a 10 plus it, there's a bunch of hands that aren't folding kind of no matter what your bet size is. What you are mostly trying to accomplish by betting small is, I guess you're trying to do a few things. There's some protection element here. Like I think someone holding like pocket sevens with a diamond, it's not trivial for them to call even a smaller bet. You also are getting some fold equity against someone who might be holding a live ace, or someone's holding like ace jack without a diamond. That's the kind of hand that you can probably get them to fold with a real. I mean, so I'm talking about a bet of like 8 or 900. And part of the reason why, like especially the cutoff, if he's holding, let's say, ace jack offsuit or pocket sevens with a diamond, in a heads up pot, you might get called by those hands, especially if you only bet like a third pot. In a multi-way pot, though, this player, it's harder for him to call with hands like those because he's effectively squeezed. He still has the button behind him, and that's going to make it less profitable for him to call with stuff like ace jack or sevens with a diamond. Ace jack with no diamond, I mean. There's also a bunch of hands that, although you'd like them to fold, you're not really a favorite against them. Like if your opponent has ace jack with a diamond or something, you're not much of a favorite against that hand. Being out of position means you might actually be not a favorite. And then, I mean, there's a lot that you're behind on this board. I mean, sometimes people flop flushes, sometimes they flop king 10 or whatever. So I mean, you're not necessarily trying to like really blow up the pot, or like the downside of betting large, even if it gives you a little bit more fold equity, not all that fold equity is fold equity that you want. I mean, you want people in there with like jack 10 no diamond, you want them in there with king jack no diamond. By betting larger, you make your opponent's range stronger. And what we have is a hand that does pretty well against the like weak to middle portion of the opponent's range, but that's doing very poorly against the top of our opponent's ranges. So we don't want to make a large bet that narrows our opponent's ranges down to just their strongest hands. I do think checking is a pretty reasonable option here also. Monotone boards tend to reward a lower level of aggression in general. In multi-way pots, checking is often more appropriate. One advantage of checking when we're in like the worst position in a multi-way pot is we get to see what everyone else does before we make our own decision. And that can be quite valuable here. This might even be a hand that we end up check folding. Even though I said a moment ago that I think we probably want to stack off to a single opponent, we don't want to get it all in against two opponents. The chances that we run into a flush or some other strong made hand are much higher when we're up against two people. So if the action goes, bet raise, we probably want to fold. If it goes bet call, what we might want to do is call and look to get it in if the turn isn't a diamond. That might be the best play. If it goes bet fold, then we can check raise all in. So given that the way we change our hand might, the way we play our hand might change depending on what people do behind us, it's valuable to see what they do behind us before we have to make a decision about our own hand. So I do see a solid case for checking. This is the ideal scenario. The buttons bet is going to be weaker than the cutoffs bet because he's betting with having seen two people check in front of him, so he has more information that people are weak. He can bet a wider range here. I think we want to raise rather than call. I don't think calling is terrible, but I like raising because we can shut this player off of some equity by raising, and I do think our hand is strong enough to get all in against the button. It's not what I'm hoping for, but yeah, I think it's good enough. I would now, would I? I think I would probably just raise all in now. I guess it's somewhat close between raising versus calling, but wow. This is an interesting spot. We actually have a hand that I think is strong enough to play for stacks on this board. We're looking at a stack to pot ratio of less than 4 on a board where it's very hard to flop a pair. And I'm not expecting that the opponent has very many good pocket pairs in his range. Most of those are probably 3-betting pre-flop. Not to mention we block aces and kings. We have a backdoor flush draw. So our equity for getting in against pocket eights is, I mean, we wouldn't want to get in if we knew we had pocket eights, but our equity against pocket eights is not too bad on this board. We do have a backdoor straight draw in addition to the backdoor flush draw. We've got 2 overcards. Our equity is not that bad against pairs, and we're going to be a big favorite against a lot of unpaired hands. Many of his unpaired hands are going to be hands that we dominate. So your first thought when you look at this board should not be, oh crap, I have ace king and it missed. I always miss with ace king. Your first thought when you look at this board should be, ace king's still a pretty good hand here. Like, I probably have the best hand. You do have a hand that benefits to some degree from fold equity. I mean, if your opponent is holding like queen jack of hearts, you'd like to make him fold that because it's pretty live against you. You also have a hand, I think, that can benefit from calls if you bet small. If you bet small, you should expect to get called by stuff like ace queen, ace jack, king queen with a backdoor flush draw, hands that you're ahead of are going to call if you make small bets, or they should call if you make small bets. So betting small here gives you opportunity to get some folds that you want, to get some calls that you want. I also think you are going to be doing some check folding in this situation, so this is also a perfectly reasonable check calling hand to induce bluffs. I wouldn't really check raise with this. I think I'd want a weaker hand to check raise as a bluff and a stronger hand to check raise as value. So I think your options here are bet small or check and call. I think they're both pretty reasonable options. Against tougher opponents, it's probably more important to mix. Against weaker opponents, I think I would err on the side of just betting small. I think weaker opponents don't respond very well to small bets. The 10 is a relatively neutral turn card. There's going to be a lot less 10x in the opponent's range than there. A jack would be a worse card. A queen would be an even worse card. So the bigger the card is, the more bad it is for us. There's going to be some 10x in his calling range. I would expect most of it to be backdoor flush draws. So I would expect it to be stuff like ace 10 of diamonds, ace 10 of clubs. So the good news is we block ace 10 of clubs. We block king 10 of clubs. So we block some of his 10x combinations. I think it's less likely that he's going to have ace 10 of hearts. That would be a dicier peel on this flop. There's still some. He can have jack 10 of diamonds, 10-9 of diamonds. There's some hands like that he may have peeled the flop bet with, especially because it was small. So it's not a guarantee. I don't think there's nearly as much value in betting again now. I know this is something a lot of people struggle with, is when to stop betting. I actually have a whole series on Tournament Poker Edge called Giving Up. It's a little bit more about bluffing, which is not exactly what we were doing here on the flop, but one of the lessons is you need to be clear on why you were betting in the first place. What were you looking to accomplish? And your purpose for betting should be changing from street to street. So one of the mistakes that people make is when they bet the flop and they think about what kinds of hands they're trying to make their opponent fold. And then on the turn, they'll name those same hands again as reasons to bet the turn. And that doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you bet the flop to make, let's say, queen jack of hearts fold, well, then you have to choose a new target for the turn because queen jack of hearts should no longer be in the opponent's range. Either you chose a bad target on the flop or he folded queen jack of hearts. You can't use queen jack of hearts as your target twice. So because we were mostly betting the flop for protection, we can't get that protection anymore, right? We got the protection we were going to get by betting the flop. There's not nearly as much we need to be concerned about protecting against on the turn. We already folded out his random queen jack of hearts kind of hands. The other reason we bet the flop was sort of thin value against ace queen, ace jack, those kind of hands, and they're going to be less inclined to call a second bet, right? They can call a single bet because they are the middle of his range. Once he folds the bottom of his range on the flop, then hands like ace queen and ace jack that don't have a backdoor flush draw, that didn't turn spades, those hands have become the new bottom of his range, and they may just fold if we bet again. So I think it's hard to expect to be ahead if a second bet is called. I also don't think we benefit very much from fold equity at this point. So now I think we should check. And what I want you to see is that this targeting process, or this process of having a clear objective for betting, is what enables me to recognize when it's time to stop betting. If all you're thinking to yourself is, this pot would be easier to play if my opponent would just go away, well, that's still true on the turn. And it's going to lead you to making the mistake of betting the turn because you're like, well, I guess I can still represent strong hands. I might have pocket aces and I still really want them to go away because my hand isn't that great, so I'm just going to keep betting. That's a sloppiness that can be avoided by being very clear about your objectives street to street and recognizing that they need to change, that you've accomplished what you could accomplish on the flop, or at least you gave yourself a chance of accomplishing what you could have accomplished on the flop. If your opponent didn't fold, it's probably because he didn't have the kind of hand that you were trying to get him to fold, rather than because he's stubborn or something like that. So I like that check. Now, I do think calling is reasonable. The opponent does have some incentive to bluff with hands that we're ahead of. Even though he doesn't have a lot of incentive to call bets with them, he does have some incentive to bluff with them. Not to mention, we still have some equity. We only have to win this pot 20% of the time. So between the times that we river an ace or a king and the times that we manage to show down the winning hand, that's appealing. So I think that we can call here. Even calling here is reasonable. I think you will see a lot of opponents. So in general, I'm not a big fan of like hero calling, especially in tournaments. Like it's a pretty high variance thing to do for this is like nearly half of our stack, like somewhere between half and a third of our stack. So it's a pretty high variance thing, and there's a lot of situations where I think people don't bluff enough. This, however, does strike me as a situation where people are going to bluff a lot. Like you've really invited the bluffing with the line that you took, and I think a lot of people have trouble just checking back on the river when they bluff the turn, they know that they can't possibly win. Like if he's sitting there holding like king, queen of spades, he knows he can't possibly win by checking back to the river. It's going to be very tempting for him to just ship it in. And I actually think there's not a whole lot of hands he can, so the other thing is, even though a lot of people are a little uncomfortable like making large bluffs, they're also uncomfortable making big, thin value bets. So like better players, you might see them jamming a hand like pocket fives here for value, pocket sevens maybe. I don't think weaker players do that as much. I think weaker players just sort of think, oh, pocket sevens is not that great of a hand, but it has some showdown value. I'm just going to check and take my showdown value and not consider that you might call a shove with ace king. What that means is they're not value betting thinly. So they're probably like more polarized than they should be, meaning he's either going to have a very strong hand or a bluff, and it's a lot easier for him to have a hand that he would want to bluff with than it is to have a very strong hand like top pair or better. He's not often going to have top pair or better, given that he didn't 3-bet pre-flop and it's kind of hard to hit that 10 on the turn. He's not going to have top pair or better very often. That doesn't necessarily mean he's imbalanced. He can just, if he's very disciplined about bluffing, he can still bluff in a way that's perfectly balanced. It just means he would have to check back a lot of likely losing hands because he's going to have very few value hands. What's more likely, I think, is that he is just going to go for go for broke, literally, with every single hand that missed, and then only do it for value with top pair or better. And that, I think, means that he's going to be bluffing more than 30% of the time we need him to be bluffing to call. Case in point, this is exactly the sort of hand that that we bet the flop to get value from this kind of. We're not a big favorite against queen jack of clubs, but like king queen of clubs, king jack of clubs probably plays the same, and then we induce from him on turn and river. So excellent, very well played. Good. You want to be defending very wide in this situation. That we know the button can have a very wide opening range. We only have to win 19% of the time. Being shallow makes it a little easier to defend our equity, but we still have a folding range. We're still supposed to be folding the worst 15 to 20% of hands, and 7 deuce offsuit is one of the very worst hands. So you're not supposed to be you're not supposed to be calling any 2 cards. We're definitely not folding this. Open shoving is actually an option, just ripping in 22 blinds. It's probably not the very best play, especially because king 9 is suited as a hand that will hold its equity pretty well in a check-check pot. Because it's suited and kind of connected, big cards, it'll play pretty well if it goes check-check. So it is, you're taking a bit of a risk when you limp. You're letting your opponent check and realize a bunch of equity when he has like 5-3 offsuit or some bad hand that couldn't call a shove. You're not really a big favorite against those hands. So letting him realize that equity for free is kind of expensive. But the upside of limping is that you also induce some bluff raises from him, which is nice. Flopping the nuts, also pretty nice. You can bet or check. They're both viable plays with this hand. With a stack to pot ratio of 8, you should seriously consider betting. It is going to be hard to get stacks in if the flop goes check. Now, it may also just be hard to get stacks in general, because anytime that you flop a flush, you also have a pretty significant blocking effect on your opponent's continuing range. Meaning, like with the 9 of spades being in our hand, well, the king and the 9 of spades being in our hand, it's kind of hard for him to have a good flush draw. The king jack of spades would be an even better checking hand, because we'd be blocking so much of his continuing range. But like, hands that he should never be folding on this flop is like anything with the king of spades in it, anything with the jack of spades in it. Most hands with the 9 of spades in it should just never be folding this flop. So we're blocking a really big portion of his continuing range when we bet the flop. We're also blocking a lot of his bluffing range though. So it kind of cuts both ways in terms of the like blocker effect. It's just going to be kind of hard to get 8 times the pot in here, even though as much as we would like to, or 7 times the pot, as much as we would like to do it, it's going to be kind of hard to do given the blocking effect of our hand and how wide his range is. The smaller our spade, so if we had like king deuce of spades, that would be, I think, a slightly better betting hand than king 9 of spades, because the blocker effect of the deuce of spades is less significant than the blocker effect of the 9 of spades. I would likely start here by checking. If you do bet, it should be small. So I like that he's betting small there. This is a call, unless you have some read that your opponent is especially nitty. He's just going to be jamming a lot of hands. Like eights is a hand you want to call against. You have perfectly fine equity against eights. He can be jamming like suited aces that are worse than yours. He can jam jack 10 suited. There's just a lot of ways for you to have. You can jam like king jack, king queen. There's a lot of hands you're going to have equity against. You're not excited to face a shove there, but it's a call. Relatively deep here, actually. Stack to pot ratio of 10. We don't have a hand that we are real excited to play for stacks. The good news is he probably doesn't have ace king or ace queen. Those are mostly going to be 3-bets. He probably doesn't have pocket tens. He probably doesn't have pocket aces. But he can have, I think, like ace jack, ace 10, ace deuce, pocket deuces. Like there's a fair number of hands we're behind where, I'm not like afraid to bet the flop. I'm just trying to plan ahead in terms of how big of a pot do we want to play here. I think we don't have a hand that's going to be looking to bet 3 times for value. So right away, what that means is checking the flop is on the table. But we don't want to check the flop with hands that want to go 3 streets. If we have pocket tens, we have pocket twos, ace deuce, like those are hands that don't want to check the flop because they're going to want to bet 3 times, or on a lot of runouts anyway. They're going to want to bet 3 times. And we can't bet 3 times if we don't bet the flop. Ace 9 is not a hand I'm likely to bet 3 times. So I do have the option of checking the flop. I'm going to want to check some straight. It could just be the flop. The next question I'm going to ask myself is this a flop where I want to bet any 2 cards? Is this a situation where I want to bet any 2 cards? I think the answer there is probably also no. I think there are hands like pocket kings, pocket queens, even more so than ace 9 that really don't benefit from betting the flop, where they're not expecting to be a big favorite or maybe not a favorite at all if a bet is called. They also don't really mind giving free cards by checking because it's hard to draw out on them. If I want to be checking hands like kings and queens, it pays to check a hand like ace 9 as well, because when I check kings and queens, I give my opponent some incentive to bluff. And ace 9 is a much better bluff catcher than kings or queens. So one option here is just check back, plan on calling bets if the opponent bets turn and river, plan on betting turn and river if he checks. That's likely the way I would play the hand, especially against weaker opponents. It might be a little obvious, it's kind of a difficult line to balance here, and I think against tougher players, you could maybe get away with just like betting your full range small so that you don't have to worry about balancing a checking range. But I think against weaker players, I wouldn't worry so much about the checking range being balanced, and I think they're probably going to make more mistakes if I check the flop than if I bet the flop. If you do bet the flop, it should be small. The main value in betting the flop, I would say, is not so much in getting called by worse, because I think you're going to get about the same amount of money from worse hands if you check the flop and put the money in later. So it's not that you're not getting money by betting the flop, it's just that you might get the same money by betting later. The main value in betting the flop is in denying equity. It's in causing him to fold hands like 8-7 that might turn a draw. It's in causing him to fold hands like pocket threes that might turn a set. Those kinds of things, although they happen rarely, they're usually pretty expensive when they do happen. So like if he has pocket threes and he binks off the 3, it's not going to happen very often, but when it does happen, he's going to get 2 more bets out of you in addition to the pot. So there is some value in denying him that opportunity, and like you are still going to be in fine shape against his calling range.